I can start with the Eddic, which is probably the poetry that more people are familiar with. It's poems about either gods or heroes, the legendary heroes, and some of the stories in these poems are thought to be really old. And they were collected in Iceland in the 13th century, so we don't know how much older they were, but at least some of them were certainly older than that. And they either tell stories about gods and heroes, or they propagate wisdom in some way or another. And these are anonymous. We don't know who composed them or when they composed them or where they composed them. Um, but they seem to have been quite widespread, and people would know the stories. They're relatively easy to understand compared to Skaldic poetry. Um, and probably there's certainly, with regard to your earlier question, there would have been female poets composing Eddic poetry as well. Skaldic poetry is a completely different kettle of fish. It's a very complicated, highly developed art form with a lot of rules regarding meter and alliteration and how you construct the poem. And it can be used for many different subjects, many different purposes. But we think, or what we most commonly think of when we think of Skaldic poetry is this kind of praise poetry for kings and chieftains, which is a form of propaganda, a form of history writing before writing was available. So you kind of locked the facts into this very complicated poetry, and that made it easy to remember accurately. And a lot of it is about the achievements of the king. So battles he fought or voyages, expeditions he led. And then if you could remember the poem, you'd remember all the important facts about that king's achievements.
Okay, welcome back to Vikingology, and today it is our very, very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Judith Jesch, who is Distinguished Professor of Viking Studies at the University of Nottingham in England. And she has a very long list of publications, including Women in the Viking Age, which is still in print, which is amazing after like 30 years. And also the Viking Diaspora, which is one of my favorites, I have to say. I really love that book. And also, are you still working on a new translation of Orkney Saga?
That's my current project at the moment, yeah.
Okay, so we'll look forward to that. But so your research focus tends to be more in the language area, right? Although you've written widely about so many different things. And so, yeah, we'll definitely meander today a bit because I want to ask a little bit about a lot of things. But language, Skaldic poetry, and the runes.
Well, what text in particular, I wouldn't call myself a linguist as such, but I like reading texts in Old Norse, whether that's poetry or inscriptions or sagas, any of those.
Yeah, well, so welcome. We're so happy to have you here.
Well, it's nice to see you both.
It's such a pleasure and an honor, actually. So, well, you know what? To get started, I'm actually going to maybe ask what might seem kind of like a silly question, but I always ask this to my students, and it's usually kind of fun. But if you had a time machine and you could go anywhere in the Viking Age, when and where would you go, and why?
Ooh, that's quite a question. When, where, and why? I think I haven't thought about this at all, so I'm not really sure. I would probably like to go to either to London in the early 11th century, to the court of King Canute, so I could hear some Skaldic poetry being recited there.
Oh, nice. Okay, because that actually, I mean, definitely is one of the questions I wanted to ask you about Skaldic poetry. And I had a student even mention this when I was, telling them this week that you were going to be on. And it's like, well, what would that look like? Is it actually, sort of like theater? Are there more than one person involved? Is it just the poet reciting? Is there any acting out of anything? I mean, one of my students even said, it's like do they have wooden swords and they're sort of pretending? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm going to ask her, like, what do you think the whole thing would look like?
Well, I think you have to start with the setting first of all. So it would be some kind of communal setting, possibly a feast. There would be the king or the chieftain in charge. There would be an audience because, it's not worth going to all that trouble to compose that difficult poetry if there isn't an audience. Other than that, I'm not really sure what it would look like. And I imagine poets vary. Some of them would probably be more theatrical, others might not. I think it also depends on the audience. I mean, there's some Skaldic poetry, for example, for English kings who might not have understood the Old Norse very well. And some Skaldic poetry is quite easy to understand, and some is really difficult to understand. So if people were serious about it, they'd be concentrating, trying to understand what the poet is saying. And if they weren't that interested, they'd just be kind of sitting there and occasionally pick up on the odd word. I mean, it's a good idea if you're composing about a king to keep repeating his name so he knows that it's a poem about him. So no, I'm not sure it was that theatrical. I think it was more of a kind of intellectual exercise for people who appreciated that sort of thing.
So, all right, if they're sitting there, like I'm imagining, sort of the movie version, right, of the big feast in the mead hall, and and it's tends.
You've seen too many movies.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it tends
all
to
that
be...
kind of throwing of chicken drumsticks across the room and stuff.
Okay, well, all right, well, let's just go with maybe just boisterous. How about that, right? And so, are they going to be? I wonder, getting to a point like, all right, everybody, calm down. Quiet now, the poet is going to start, or is he competing with all of the rest of it that's going on?
I can imagine he would be competing very often. They start with some kind of stanza calling for a hearing, really. They're telling people to be quiet. But I think there's so much evidence that it was considered a really highly skilled craft that was extremely well rewarded. I mean, you could get a whole ship for composing a poem about the right king. So I think the king would have made sure that people listened, because otherwise his money would be wasted, really, if people couldn't hear the praise in the Skaldic poem.
And we keep saying he. Do we know for sure that they were all male?
The poets.
Yes.
No, there are a few female poets, not very many, and we don't really know much about them, and one or two of them might have been fictional. I think certainly there were women who were able to compose in that genre, but I think the profession of court poet was almost certainly a male profession.
Okay. So actually, maybe that too. I mean, we kind of dove right into Skaldic poetry, and I think maybe for our audience, let's do a little bit of just, the two kind of main forms of poetry that we know from the Viking Age, between the Skaldic and the Eddic. And can you explain a little bit about what those two are?
Yeah, I can start with the Eddic, which is probably the poetry that more people are familiar with. It's poems about either gods or heroes, or legendary heroes, and some of the stories in these poems are thought to be really old, and they were collected in Iceland in the 13th century, so we don't know how much older they were, but at least some of them were certainly older than that. And they either tell stories about gods and heroes, or they propagate wisdom in some way or another. And these are anonymous. We don't know who composed them, or when they composed them, or where they composed them. But they seem to have been quite widespread, and people would know the stories. They're relatively easy to understand compared to Skaldic poetry. And probably certainly, with regard to your earlier question, there would have been female poets composing Eddic poetry as well. Skaldic poetry is a completely different kettle of fish. It's a very complicated, highly developed art form with a lot of rules regarding meter and alliteration and how you construct the poem. And it can be used for many different subjects, many different purposes, but we think, or what we most commonly think of when we think of Skaldic poetry, is this kind of praise poetry for kings and chieftains, which is a form of propaganda, a form of history writing before writing was available. So you kind of locked the facts into this very complicated poetry, and that made it easy to remember accurately, and a lot of it is about the achievements of the king. So battles he fought or voyages, expeditions he led. And then if you could remember the poem, you'd remember all the important facts about that king's achievements.
So how would one go about training to become a skaldic poet?
We know a little bit about that from Egil Saga, for instance, a well-known saga. You went to an older poet and you learned from him. I think, you know, it was a completely oral genre, and it was very much unlike Eddic poetry, which was in, but not only anonymous, but possibly communal in some way, that, you know, anyone could add to an Eddic poem. The Skaldic poet was very much the author of his own poem. And we know the names of most of these poets as well, even if we don't always know much about them. So, you know, they were highly trained through talking to other poets. And then, of course, the Icelanders came along later in the 13th century, people like Snorri Sturluson in his Edda. What he's doing is that's a textbook really on how to compose Skaldic poetry.
Now, forgive my ignorance, but you know, in popular culture, we talk about skalds a lot, and here we're using the word poets. And so, could you illuminate us a little bit on why the precision in nomenclature and the difference between the two, and where should we be careful when using those words, and can we use them interchangeably?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I call them poets because that's what they are. They're doing things with language in a way that only poets do things with language. The term skald is the Old Norse term for poet. There's some discussion about what its origin really is, but what's interesting is that we have several runic inscriptions which mention people who are called skalds, but we don't know whether they were actually poets, and there's no poetry in those particular runic inscriptions. And I think originally it may just have referred to someone whose job it was to kind of record information, record facts in an oral culture, whether or not they did that through poetry. But by the time we're talking about, when we have the sagas and the Eddas from medieval Iceland, then they use the word skald to about as someone we'd recognize as a poet.
And now, just to understand if I've made a mistake in my novels, for example, did the skalds ever recite their poems in song form? Since I talk about the skalds' songs, which you hear, you know, this area of history is totally out of my depth, so I'm a novice here.
Well, I'm completely tone deaf, so I'm not sure I would know. I don't think we really know. The poetry isn't really conceptualized as song. It's conceptualized as all kinds of things. There's this myth of the mead of poetry. It's conceptualized as a drink, so something that flows from your mouth. And there's not really, I don't think there's any mention of musical instruments. So if you're thinking of, you know, Old English and the harp and so on, there doesn't seem to be any such thing going on. But it's possible that when they recited it, they did it in a way that sounded musical in some way. I don't really know. Unfortunately, it's one of the many things we don't know about in detail.
Yeah, I have, when I talk about language and art in my class, there's a video clip from the University of York, where some of the language students there, I don't know if you've seen that, where they've helped the museum there with, you know, having, you know, some of the staff, you know, a little bit of Old Norse or whatever. So like, what is the sound of the Vikings, you know, kind of thing. And, you know, right prior to that, I have them read an English translation of a stanza from Krakemal. And, you know, so they read it and they kind of understand what it's saying. But then when they hear it, and there's, you know, it's not the same poem that they recite in that video clip, but when they hear it and they listen to it, it's kind of like, oh, now it sounds like poetry. Because when they hear the Norse version, it's like they hear, even though they don't know the language, right? they feel the melodiousness of it, and they hear the rhyming of certain words and stuff, and so then it was kind of like, oh, it really clicked for them. So the English translation kind of ruined it a little bit.
Well, I think you're onto something there. I think if you've got rhyme and alliteration and all these metrical devices, you don't need music. That's my view.
Yeah, I agree. So how long would these last, these recitations?
We have very few poems that survive in their entirety because they were chopped up and referred to in the sagas as evidence. But it's a stanzaic genre, so each stanza in a standard Skaldic Drottquite stanza consists of 48 syllables, so that's quite short. And you could easily have 40 or 50 or even more stanzas in a long poem. I don't know what the longest one would be, but as I say, we have very few that survive in their entirety like that.
I think it brings up for me an interesting thing that I also like my students to sort of ponder, and that is, telling them that we don't have to commit anything to memory in the modern era, right? I mean, we just Google it or whatever, look in all of those books that are behind you and find the information we need. And so we don't do that. And then to think about what it's like to, pass along information in this way for everything in an oral culture. Can you speak a little bit to sort of, what kind of memories these people would have had?
Well, the most obvious example there is the laws. The laws of early Iceland tell us that the law speaker had to know all the laws and recite them over a period of 3 years, so a third of the law each year. And of course, by the time the laws are written down, they're no longer oral, so we don't know whether the laws were a lot shorter in the oral period. But that's a lot of stuff to commit to memory. So that, yes, but I think the whole culture was geared towards verbal culture. So there's the laws, there's the poetry, even all the kind of names and nicknames that people had. That it shows that they really appreciated language and the interesting things you could do with language.
Yeah, I always wonder that about the law speaker, because I find that like that part, the whole all thing setup, I think is really interesting anyway. But the fact that the guy would do that and remember it, but then I'm thinking, okay, they don't have any fact checking mechanism in that
No.
era, right? So it's like maybe he's remembering all of it, but they all just have to sort of take it on faith that he is, right?
Yeah. Well, that's where Skaldic poetry is actually. It solved that problem with its very strict metrical rules and its very strict number of syllables and where you have to have the rhyme and the alliteration. And, the whole point of that is so that you remember things correctly. It was really important to remember things correctly. But yeah, the laws are to a certain extent formulaic, so that possibly helps people remember them. And I'm sure there were other people other people knew the law. I don't think the law speaker was the only one who knew it. It was just his job to remind people of what the laws were. So probably there might not have been fact checking, but there might have been someone who put their hand up and said, nope, you haven't remembered that correctly.
So all of this, I mean, we're talking about this oral culture, but of course, we mentioned also at a certain point it gets written down, both the laws and the poems. And we often sort of say like, oh, well, think about the sources very carefully because they were written down long after the events that they recount, right? But where is the memory in between? Like what are the sources Snorri Sturluson's using, for instance, to try to get at least some sort of faithful account maybe of what what they're writing about?
Well, that's the $64,000 question that scholars have been talking about for generations. There's a lot of things. I mean, the poetry is important for certain genres in particular, particularly the King sagas, precisely because they recognized that they were actually a source. The authors of the King sagas cited these Skaldic stanzas just like a modern historian would cite his or her sources in the footnotes. For a lot of saga genres, genealogies are really important. That's another form of kind of verbal culture, a way of remembering things in an oral culture. And then there must have been stories, and stories can be attached to particular places in the landscape, for instance. I think that is a good way of helping people remember. Every time you pass a particular burial mound, you say, oh yeah, that's great granddad lying in there. And did you know that my great granddad killed, you know, a troll or whatever? So putting all these things together can then give you really quite a broad overall picture, and then they fill the gaps with making things up, basically.
I love the fluid nature of that, I have to say. I don't know. The fact that it can
fluid in what way?
Oh, I don't know. That just you know, I don't know, filling in the gaps as they go. You know, my students always say the telephone game, right? You know, kind of thing. But I mean, I like that. I like that it's not so precise. I just like the malleability of it, so that, you know, I think the kernel of maybe if there's some sort of, you know, maybe moral or ethical theme or something that's trying to be relayed, then that stays the same, but some of the details can be embellished. I think it just kind of makes it an interesting art form. And again, it's something that we are not really used to here, just because we can rely on text a lot. I mean, the same, I think, has to do with the art, like the visual art and design that comes out of the Viking Age, and, you know, trying to express to people, you know, just how much, you know, how important it is to put designs on everything, even mundane objects, because you live in this very immersive visual and oral world, right? I mean, you just don't rely on text. And so the fact that that can just be all, I don't know, just very fluid and organic and changing from community to community.
And some of that art also alludes to stories. So that's another way of remembering stories, is if you got pictures of them. And actually within poetry, I mean, the thing about Eddic poetry, it tells the story, but in Skaldic poetry, it doesn't really tell the story, but it makes use of kennings, which in themselves allude to mythological stories that we only know because Snorri wrote them down in his Edda. So it's kind of chicken and egg thing. People knew the stories, so you could use a kenning referring to some mythological story, you know, for example, about the mead of poetry, and everyone would know the story just from hearing those trigger words, mead, poetry. Ah, yes, that's when they all spat in a vat together, and then made a guy out of it, and then they killed him, and his blood was turned into mead, and, you know, there's a whole long story about it, and you just need to remember mead and poetry, and that you've got your story, really.
Good old Kvasir. I was just told
Him,
that story. I just told that story yesterday. I'm like, okay, this is what happens when you have a culture that's sitting around with nothing to do in the long winters in Scandinavia. And they probably drank too much ale. And then all of a sudden there's a guy who's created out of spit, and then dwarves kill him and create the mead of poetry. And then Odin like steals it from the giant. It's like, oh my gosh, who could make this up? You know, you couldn't, even if you tried.
No, well, they did.
They did. Yeah, they did.
But without trying, I think it came naturally, as you say.
Yeah.
So how much of the oral tradition was written down through runes? Runes were limited in what they could convey. But how much evidence do we have for that poetry direct, as opposed to written down a couple of centuries later?
It depends on what kind of poetry, and depends what you mean by poetry. I think comes back to your earlier question, because not all verse is poetry. But we certainly have rune stones, which are basically just memorial inscriptions to the dead, mainly from the 10th and 11th centuries. Sometimes have a little verse about the dead person. And those are, you know, they're not verse that was known anywhere else. They're composed for that person and that occasion. So it kind of shows that people were familiar with these genres. Those are mainly in what we would call Eddic style. So this is the kind of simpler form of poetry. There is one Skaldic stanza, though, on the runestone from a place called Karlovy on the island of Öland in Sweden, off the coast of Sweden in the Baltic, which is dated probably to around the year 1000. So that's a good 200 years earlier than the earliest manuscript recording of that kind of poetry. So, and there's other little bits of poetry in various kinds of runic inscriptions. So that I think there's enough there to show us that actually these genres did exist before they came to be written down. So there must have been loads that never came to be written down. The authors of the 13th century selected the poetry that they wanted to record. They probably made a little bit of it up as well. It's not necessarily all authentic as such. But yeah, so I think we can say with certainty, and there are, if you think something like the Galahus horn from around the year 400 AD, it's got a little line of verse on it, which follows the same rules as Eddic verse many centuries later. So I think that there's quite a long tradition of these poetic forms, which are also related to Old English poetic forms and other forms in other Germanic languages. So there is a long tradition for the poetry at any rate. Runes weren't really used to write prose narratives, though, except insofar as, it says so-and-so put up this stone in memory of his father, such and such, who died in Jerusalem or whatever.
Or that one that was found, there was an old prison that was in Istanbul. It was pretty recent, I think in the last 10 years. And they found what they thought was a prison from about 1,000 years ago. And there was a rune where there were runes carved into it. And I think it said something very simple, like Ivar was here,
I don't know about any prison. Are you thinking of what was Hagia Sophia is now the Blue Mosque in Istanbul? And there is some Viking graffiti there, which does say Halfdan.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, it was something like that. Yeah, I'm not remembering correctly, but I remember seeing something like that. Like somebody just left some graffiti, and it was their name. Like I was here.
Absolutely. And also, one of my favorites is it's called the Piraeus Lion. So it was originally in Piraeus, the port of Athens, but then it was moved to Venice, and it's outside the arsenal. So if you're ever in Venice, there's this lion, a marble lion. It's much older. I can't remember exactly, but something like the 2nd century or thereabouts. And in the 11th century, some Swedes came along and carved a really nice design, like those serpents that you see on runestones. They carved the same kind of design with their names and the name of the leader that they're following. They were probably in the Varangian Guard on their way to Istanbul or wherever. And they vandalized, but in a really interesting way, this lion. And actually, it's been possible, the design they used for the several inscriptions on the lion, and one of the inscriptions has a design which is almost exactly matched by a runestone back home in Sweden. So that they can even pinpoint where these guys came from on the basis of the one back in Sweden.
Yeah, that's really an interesting case. I was just coincidentally, sort of just a few days ago, I was looking at that again, and the transcription is pretty. I can imagine they're like standing there, like it took them a long time to write this. It's not a short little was here.
No, it's quite long.
It's very much a praise little piece to one of the guys in their troop, and even says he was great and he got a lot of gold, wherever they were and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Next time
somebody comes around and I hear a lot of people when they hear that I'm into Vikings and they go, oh, but weren't they just murderers and pillagers? And I'll be sure to add, oh, and also vandals, and they left a lot of graffiti.
They left graffiti all over the place, actually, but then so did all kinds of other people.
Yeah. Right. That won't redeem them, probably, CJ.
No. Well, no. So there is a little bit of poetic graffiti, even.
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of cool, though. I mean, it definitely humanizes them a little bit beyond just this sort of knuckle dragger warrior kind of trope that we have often, in popular culture. So, I mean, that actually, it brings to mind something, you know, it's talking about sort of like Venice and, you know, some of these stones in Sweden and with, you know, other places. And we've asked this to some other people before, and so I'm curious about your thoughts of as far as like the Viking Age, or I mean, this is a vast world, and they went right. I mean, it's like, or are there many Viking ages sort of kind of going on at the same time over the course of those 3 centuries?
Yeah, how long have you got?
I'm here all day.
That's a really interesting but complicated question. And I suppose in the end, the boring answer is it all boils down to what you mean by Viking Age and how you define Viking Age. Because, you know, the thing I have to keep reminding myself that even today, there's not a huge number of people live in Scandinavia. So, you know, and back then there were far fewer. So for a lot of people to leave Scandinavia and go to Greenland, to North America, to the British Isles, to the Mediterranean, to the Far East, you know, you'd empty the place. So I think you have to then start thinking about the Viking Age as a period in which these people who left Scandinavia then kind of started various processes which weren't entirely down to them, but it might have involved other people that they got involved with, or even just the local inhabitants were affected by these movements and what's going on. And you can't really have just millions of Vikings going off in every direction over a whole long period. The other thing that people get very excited about and annoyed and angry with each other about what are the dates of the Viking Age, because most people start in 793, the attack on Lindisfarne, but that's a completely Anglo-centric view of the Viking Age. Or when did it end? Did it end in 1066, you know, with another Anglo-centric date for the end of the Viking Age? And of course, well, as a historian, you know better than I do that these periodizations are really kind of a bit abstract, and they're kind of imposed on the past by modern scholars. So, I mean, what I like to look for is, well, what's actually going on? What changes are coming about? Who's doing what where? And possibly, you know, Viking expansion in the East, for example, might have different kind of chronological parameters than those going off to the West. It's different if you're going somewhere that is fully inhabited, like England or Scotland or somewhere, rather than going to Iceland where there was nobody before then. So, and then the thing most people use to kind of indicate the end of the Viking Age is a number of things. First of all, there's a general conversion to Christianity. Secondly, there is the emergence of what we recognizably European models of kingship. And with Christianity comes also the habit of writing. So once you start writing, that is a big conceptual change in life. And those 3 things, they go together, really. They support each other. Writing supports Christianity and vice versa. The kings support the church supports the kings. And then society is quite fundamentally changed. But this isn't something that happens overnight. So you could say it took, I mean, there's a really good book by Olivier Steinson in which he argued it took about 300 years for Iceland to become Christianized, depending on how you define what Christianization actually is. So we can have fluid understandings of the Viking Age. The most important thing, I think, is just to state what when you're talking about the Viking Age, state what you mean by it, and then you can mean whatever you like by it as long as you're clear about it.
Yeah, for me, that brings up 2 things. One is to say the Vikings, but what we're really talking about is some Vikings, but otherwise like Scandinavian people who are just going out into the world, right? I'm in the camp of roughly 750 to 1100. For
that's fine by me.
But then also, I mean, it begs the question of, you know, do Vikings define the age, or does the age define Vikings? Right? I mean, I don't know.
Well, the most important thing I think is to use round numbers, because if you say 793 to 1066, it makes it sound like everything changed overnight in that year, and it didn't. Whereas if you say 1100, it's vague, you know, give or take a decade this way or that way.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that when you were at the, you evoked this idea that Scandinavia is a small place and it's not heavily populated. So when we speak of so-called Vikings, there wouldn't have been that many of them, right? And so their impact globally, and it brings back some memories of one of our first episodes with Dr. Matthew Panesi, who is a historian on monasticism in the 9th and 10th centuries in Western Europe. And the first thing that he...
8th and 9th.
Oh, 8th and 9th centuries. I apologize. Yeah. But his first thing was, he's like, I spent a whole career avoiding the Vikings because in terms of the broad breadth of how many monasteries there were and the wide reach of monasticism, etc., the Vikings were just a little blip, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about 2 or 3 monasteries getting hit out of thousands, right? So for them, they could just kind of say, and for me, it was really illuminating, because I'm so hyper focused on who are the Vikings, who are these people, that I feel like before that, I tended to overestimate their impact on the world, when in reality, it was much less, right? It's just my bias because I was looking at one place, but then when you look at it in the broad landscape of the themes that were happening at the time, right, they're a small part, an important part, but smaller than people might think.
I absolutely agree with you, and but I think you started off by saying Scandinavia is a small place. It's small in terms of population. It's absolutely huge in terms of landmass. I mean, the thing I always trot out for my students is that the northern tip of Norway is further from the southern tip of Norway than Rome is from the southern tip of Norway, and that doesn't even include Denmark. But getting back to what you were saying, I think the way I see it is, I've slightly lost my thread there. Yeah, it's not so much that they were very important in the grand scheme of things, because what they did is other people were doing as well, and they interacted with global trends and other people doing things around the world. But what's interesting to me about the Vikings, at least in a European context, is that they were different. So when they interacted with monasteries or whatever, they were bringing their own kind of way of looking at monasteries. But they weren't the only ones who attacked monasteries. The Irish were constantly attacking each other's monasteries throughout this period. So I think, to me, the Vikings are just interesting. Unlike you, I'm hyper focused on them. That's what I'm interested in. But what their achievement was to just kind of bring a new tune to all the kind of discord that's going on around the world at the time.
And I think a theme of terror that Europe hadn't, because the Irish could attack their own monasteries, but they couldn't show up in Rome. The Vikings could, as we've discussed previously in the podcast. Their ships, they had so we had pirates with a technological advancement that put them ahead of everybody else. So they could just as easily show up in northern Norway or Rome, right? And no one else could do that at the time. I think that's what made them so shocking, even though their impact may not, I think Europe as a whole probably hyper focused on them too, because it's kind of like that whole, I hate to bring this up in a more academic discussion, but like in Family Guy, the show, where Stewie promises to pay Brian back, with the slap, and they spend like 3 episodes, with Brian in anticipation of the slap. Right. And he just lives in terror because he doesn't know when it's going to come. It's going to come, but he doesn't know when. It's kind of like the Vikings are kind of like that, right? Like they're going to show up. We just don't know when. We don't know where. So it kind of brings this new level of psychological terror to the people of Europe, because then it's like they could show up anywhere. They show up in Paris, not, in Ireland. Almost Rome. And that as the story goes, it was actually the city of Luna And they thought it was Rome due to a navigational error.
No, so what you're saying is that they had an impact out of proportion to their numbers for various reasons, including the ships and the navigational ability and all that. So absolutely, yeah. So you don't need many Vikings to have an impact.
Although I think the terror was, probably pretty much front-ended, right? Because we know from some of the sources, like it starts to get, and we even talked about that with Matthew Panesi, the chronicle accounts are sort of, and the Vikings came again, or the Northmen came again, or the one that's my favorite, they came for their usual surprise attack. It's like all of a sudden it starts to lose its steam when they could sort of bank on it. They knew they were going to show up at some point.
Yeah.
But it does beg the question, actually, that we talked with Leszek Gardella in March about, the Vikings in the Western Slavic lands, and the whole lead-in on the episode. If you watch it, the very first piece is and CJ saying, "How did the Vikings change Poland?" And Leszek just with a straight face just says, "They didn't." And so, since you've written about diaspora, it does beg the question, what kind of influence then do they have that's lasting or not in these various places?
Well, it's different in different places is the short answer. And because I live in England, I'm very aware of the effect they had here in England. They had certainly more influence in Scotland, certain parts of Scotland at any rate, than England. They had a lot of influence in Iceland because there weren't many people there or nothing worth speaking of. And then various other places, they kind of came and went. As you say, they just kind of turned up and left again and didn't really change anything. But their experiences, even in those places that they kind of just visited and then came back from, I think, also fed into what they were doing all over the place. So I think each region, it's an interesting paradox that each region has its own separate history, and yet they are all connected in various ways because of the mobility of the Viking Age.
Yeah, I did note in your diaspora book when you mentioned, that the most lasting, or the place that exhibits the most lasting influence of the Viking Age is in Iceland still to this day. And as we've talked before, I spend time there a lot. And 2 or 3 years ago, I wrote a piece about that because I was just feeling it everywhere when I was there, and just interacting with my friends and other people, but going to the various sites. And it's like, I could just feel these threads of these things that we know about the Viking Age and how people were, and that you still feel it in the Icelanders or in some of these places. And because it's such a deeply ingrained part of their cultural inheritance, it's like they don't even recognize, that they're kind of acting that way. But there were all of these things, and it just kind of kept stacking up. So I was like, I have to write something about this because it just seems so obvious there. But so then you mentioned, and I want to talk about this with the Orkney saga, because, obviously Scotland is one of the places that the Vikings went. And I think that with the Anglo-centric part of it, even though it's part of the UK, people focus on the England aspect so much and don't really realize the islands and Scotland and how much of a presence the Norse had there. I actually noticed it when the first time my husband and I went to Norway over a decade ago, and we're like, why are all these Scottish people here? We had no idea of this sort of very close connection. But can you speak to a little bit about that, sort of their presence on those islands, and then also, your interest in this particular saga, and maybe what the Viking life was like there, maybe as compared to someplace like Iceland or someplace else?
Well, it's interesting because, I love Iceland and the sagas generally. And you go to Iceland and all the places mentioned in the saga are still there in the landscape. You'll see a sign saying, Bergthorskvatn is here, straight from Jarl Saga, but you don't see anything else except the name or the landscape, but there's not much landscape description in Icelandic sagas. And then you go to Orkney, and there are actually standing buildings or ruined buildings in the place that don't necessarily go back to the earliest Viking Age. That for that you need an archaeologist to dig them up out of the ground. But something like St. Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall, built in the 12th century, it's whacking great beautiful red sandstone cathedral. It's been there since the 12th century. It's mentioned in the Saga. There, you know, and people who say, oh, the sagas, they're just literature, they're fiction, you know, we don't need to take account of them. Well, actually, in the case of Orkney Saga, you've still got that landscape and many of the places in the landscape, not just the names, but then also because they built in stone rather than turf, buildings that survive, and the language. I mean, nowadays they speak English or a form of English we call Scots, which is was brought to Orkney and Shetland in the early modern period by people from the south of Scotland. But the Old Norse language was, it's hard to tell exactly when it died out, but there is evidence that it was in use well into the early modern period, and there's some little traces of it as late as the 17th or 18th century. So the interesting question is, and this is another thing that's much debated. First of all, when did they arrive? What happened to the people who were living there before? And then how long did they keep speaking Old Norse there? None of which we have a very clear answer to. You would think, because of geography, that they just came straight over from Norway and thought, oh yeah, here's Shetland, we'll stop here. Yeah, Shetland's okay, but there's some more islands down there. Orkney, they look a bit better, we'll go there. But there has been some discussion recently that actually maybe the settlement of the Northern Isles was a little bit later than other activity in and around the North Sea, the Irish Sea, the English Channel, the kind of more southerly parts of the British Isles, which were perhaps a bit more attractive, certainly to raiders and traders rather than settlers. But certainly by around 900, there were people of Scandinavian origin living in Orkney and Shetland and northern Scotland. And then they developed this polity, which we can call the Orkney Earldom or something like that, which was a part of Scandinavia until the middle of the 15th century. It first belonged to Norway, but then Norway became part of Denmark. So it ended up, and then Denmark gave it back to Scotland in the 15th century. So, you know, it's part of Britain or the United Kingdom that wasn't British or part of the United Kingdom until really long after the Viking Age ended.
So it was an earldom then, it wasn't a kingdom. Like
no, they owed allegiance to the King of Norway originally, and then later the King of Denmark.
Oh, well, see, now there's another TV reference for all you people out there who watched The Last Kingdom. You just watched the movie that was like 7 Kings Must Die, and it was the King of Orkney, the King of Shetland, the King, like all of the little islands. It's like,
no.
uh-oh, we have to tell Bernard Cornwell he got that wrong.
Oh no, he knows. He knows. When I interviewed him after the round table at Leeds, and we did an email correspondence, and I interviewed him for my blog, and that was one of the things that he said, because the question was, you know, how historical does historical fiction have to be? And he said, well, I'm not a historian. My job is first and foremost to write a good story. So he's and he in the back, to his credit, in the back of his books, he puts where he deviates from real history and where he doesn't, and it's actually it's very well done. So, but yes, it's the oops, but he knows.
Yes, but how many people read the bit at the back? I suppose, you know, that's always the difficult bit. And then
the title 7 Kings Must Die is better than 2 Kings and 5 Earls Must Die. Well, so what drew you to Orkney, Inga?
I think precisely that it's at that weird intersection of, let's, for the sake of argument, call them history and literature. It's kind of neither one thing nor the other. You know, it's set in this recognizable landscape with places whose names still exist today. But it's got lots of weird and wonderful stories in it as well, including one version of the Blood Eagle story, the notorious Blood Eagle story. It's got poisoned shirts. It's got people going mad in a Neolithic burial mound. It's got evil women. It's got people with wonderful nicknames, you know, Thorfinn Skull Splitter, who's given his name to a very strong beer that's brewed there, so you can split your skull in different ways.
I love that.
And so that's kind of one part of the answer, but the other part of the answer is because I'm a bit of a nerd, and it's of interest to me because there is no such thing as Orkney Saga, or at least there is no medieval manuscript which contains the complete saga the way you will find it in your Penguin Classics translation, or even in your Islandsk Fornrit edition. Parts of it survive in different manuscripts from very different periods. When you compare them, they're often quite different. Some parts of it only survive in a 16th century translation into Danish. Then other little snippets survive in even later Icelandic manuscripts of people who are interested in the poetry. That's another thing I should have mentioned. There's a lot of poetry in the saga. So it has a bit of everything. It's a kind of complicated textual history, which I enjoy trying to work out. And I don't think is sufficiently explained in existing editions and translations, which is why I'm working on this new translation. It's got good stories. It's got this kind of landscape that you can visit and recognize from the saga. So it has everything, really.
It sounds to me like you're maybe in the same camp as Jesse about Earls Saga, that, you know, the archaeology that he did there, and just the idea that there's real history in there. There has to be. It seems to me like it couldn't be as complex as all you're describing, that, and then it's just some complete fabrication that somebody makes
no
up.
no I don't know specifically about Egil Saga, but I think that's true of, or there are many different saga genres, as you know, and in some of them, the sagas of Icelanders, the king sagas, and a few other saga genres are based on historical fact. And the interesting part is, well, you know, can we identify that historical fact, or how much, you know, we don't know. We'll never know, but it's fun to try and work out on what basis these, you know, as I was saying earlier, there's so many different things like genealogies, poetry, stories associated with the landscape all go into writing this saga. It's not something that has just sprung from the author's brain just like that. They're putting things together, and in some cases with what I would say is historical intent. Whether or not they succeed is a different matter. I think it's the intent that's interesting. They're actually trying to write about the past, I think. That's what the whole, a huge proportion, not all of it by any means, but a huge proportion of medieval Icelandic literature is actually set in the past. And I think that's relatively unusual. And it's set in a historical past. It's set in their own past. In the case of Egil Saga or other sagas of Icelanders in that period when Iceland was first settled, and shortly thereafter. In the case of the king sagas, you know, a kind of longer period going further back in time, but also closer to their own time. So they were, for whatever reason, obsessed with the past. So they were the kind of the original historians, really. They wanted to know about the past, and they went about it with what tools they had. And they didn't necessarily object to occasionally kind of not so much inventing things, but just kind of working out how they think things were.
I think that brings to mind something, because I asked Jesse about this a little bit, as far as with Iceland specifically, you know, but so many of this, all the saga literature that comes out of there, and it's like, why there? You know, it's like a complete backwater. You know, it's the opposite of what we normally think about where literary traditions develop. You know, it's not urban, it's not, you know, very literate, and all, et cetera, et cetera. And then he had a really interesting comment about them, sort of this kind of frontier mentality, right? And you're going out, and it gets into your diaspora stuff too. It's like these people who go into someplace new and then kind of have to sort of define who they are now in this new place relative to where they came from.
Yep.
And all of that. And so it's the process, like in the 19th century, right, with nationalism, it's the process of myth making and sort of defining who we are.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to me.
No, I think that's very much the case. But also, you know, I think it also relates to what I was talking about earlier, their interest in language and verbal art forms. That's what most of their creativity went into, whether it's stories or poems or the law or genealogies or nicknames, and all of it. It's all part of a package, really.
Well, as we kind of get towards the end of an hour here, I mean, I was going to ask you what keeps the Viking interesting for you, but I think you've kind of said it here.
I haven't finished with it yet.
Do you know how much longer?
What do you mean?
How much longer are you going to be working on this project?
Oh, till I die.
You're never gonna
oh no, the project you mean?
Okay.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
No, I suppose I've got another year or two to finish that, but then I'll find something else.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's go on.
I do have a quick question about the Orkneys. I don't know if I'm remembering correctly. I did see an article a few years ago about a genetic study that was carried out. I think it was in Scotland. I don't remember if it's the Orkneys specifically, but the big ho-hum was that the people in these islands that were tested thought that they were mostly descended from Picts, but then it was revealed that they were all mostly Norwegian, and it kind of reshaped how we see the settlement of certain islands in Scotland. And so was it the Orkneys that where they did that, or was it
well, no, well, the study I'm thinking of sort of compared the Northern Isles, so Orkney and Shetland, with the Western Isles, so the Hebrides with Iceland, just to kind of get some sense of what the balance is. I mean, I think and there were different proportions of Scandinavian or not Scandinavian people, and different proportions sometimes of men versus women having Scandinavian ancestry. But I think the whole you know, there is no such thing as a Pictish gene or a Scandinavian gene. What you're looking at is patterns across Europe, and there's a preponderance of certain kind of genes. And at that time, they were comparing the genes of people that live there today with the genes of people who live in Norway today, or wherever. And it's not straightforward. And the other thing I think of is islands in particular, I think, are generally very well connected to the outside world. And I think there's probably more mobility to and from islands than there are people who kind of live a long way inland. So, but insofar as we can say anything about the genetics of these places, there certainly is I think in the case of Orkney, it was something like 30% of the people tested, both men and women, had genes that were similar to people living in Norway at the time. So yeah, you know, it kind of fills out the picture a little bit, these genetic studies, but I don't think it's the final word on anything. I think we have to be a bit careful. I mean, I did one of these tests once, and I discovered that I, like many others, is 2% Neanderthal, which I was very proud of, actually. I quite like to think of my Neanderthal ancestry.
Those were the ones that were victorious, right?
No, they weren't.
They weren't.
No.
Oh, okay.
They got wiped out by the other guys.
Oh.
It's funny though, because it's on my website and on my social media, I get a lot of people who reach out asking me about, oh, I got my genetic testing done and I got this and this, and then they ask me questions. And first of all, my usual first question myself is, what about what I'm putting out there? makes people think that I'm anything of an expert on it. Yeah, I don't know. So I actually found a good out of the box answer, especially when it comes to genetic studies, which is to say it's a very new science, it's very imprecise, and that's why it keeps changing. And so I wouldn't put too much salt into what you get from one of those tests. Plus, they only go out back a certain number of generations, because I'll get the people who are like, "Oh, I'm related to Ragnar Lothbrok," and I'm like, "Good for you." Bad news, well, he may not have existed.
Well, the really good answer there, and I got this from a geneticist once. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the percentage, but it's something extraordinarily high, that genetically speaking, we're about 90% equal to a banana.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's like the one I really appreciated is I saw it was a documentary that showed that we're something like 94% genetically related to a chimpanzee. But what's even more interesting is that male humans and male chimpanzees are at like 96%, when male humans and female humans are only like 94%. Now my numbers could be wrong because I'm just, but it was like so human males and human chimpanzees are more genetically related to each other than human males and human females.
Why does that not surprise me?
Yeah.
So is the genetic craze, a big deal over there? I mean, it is.
Oh, yeah, no, it is very much. Okay. I do remember some years ago there was a program in which they were there was a time when the easiest test to do was Y chromosome, so men basically, and what their ancestry was, and they tested this poor guy who lived in the northeast of England and really, really, really wanted to be a Viking. And I don't know how much you know, but at the time, any rate, the idea was that you could tell Norwegian origin separately from Danish, but the Danish was very similar to the Anglo-Saxon, the English, and this guy wanted a Norwegian ancestry, but turned out he had this kind of Danish Anglo-Saxon gene ancestry, which you can't tell apart, and he kind of burst into tears because he so wanted to be a Viking, and he didn't realize that the Danes were Vikings too. He could easily have been a Viking in his ancestry. But anyway, if you go back 1,000 years, the Y chromosome, it's just one straight line back. And how many other ancestors have you had in the last 1,000 years, apart from your great-great, I don't know how many times, grandfather?
Well, that's interesting to hear, because I always think of it as kind of a quintessentially American preoccupation, because unless you're Native American, we're all from somewhere else. We've got like the ultimate diverse mutt society here. And so, people are interested in sort of trying to figure out where they came from, which I think is kind of a natural.
Well, that's true here as well, until about, I'm not very good with numbers, but 16 or 18,000 years ago, this island was covered in ice. So everybody's an immigrant to Britain. Whatever people try and have you believe otherwise. And that's the human condition, really, moving around the world.
Well, so that story that you said about this guy who wants to be a Viking so badly, I mean, that kind of, I think probably last question I have for you is, to what do you attribute this lasting popularity of these people? I mean, it's just this juggernaut that never seems to stop.
Different things to different people. I mean, yes, it's a juggernaut. On one hand, it has been going at least since the 19th century. On the other hand, I've been around long enough that I can see that it's taken off in a big way in the last 20 or 30 years, and it wasn't quite so big before then, just in the number of students I get, wanting to study it. When I first started, I didn't get so many students. So yeah, undoubtedly there are people attracted by what you called the knuckle dragger something or other. I had a colleague once who wrote famously, the Vikings were ruffians, but they were cultured ruffians. So some of us like that cultured bit, the poetry, the art, the sagas, it's all part of the same thing in a way. So maybe it is that combination of, on one hand, really quite basic things which attract certain people, and then the slightly more, I don't know, complex or sophisticated or different or interesting things that attract other people. And then of course there's Norse mythology, which we've hardly touched on, which in the end it does also boil down to really good stories, whether it's the sagas or the story of the mead of poetry or any of those other stories. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about teaching Old Norse is, watching students' jaws drop as they read these stories, which I think are just some of the best stories ever written.
Yeah.
I heard in another podcast that you did that you're a fan of the Lord of the Rings.
No, not quite.
Oh.
I was.
Oh, you were past tense.
Well,
The reason I bring it up is the cultured ruffian.
Yes.
Aragorn is a good example of that, right? Because he can go around and kill orcs and be a ruffian, but he can also be very soft and recite poetry to Arwen. So I mean, it's kind of that,
yes.
that dynamic.
That's, when I was 14, then he was my hero, of course. And no, the reason I said I was is because I think it was the year I was 14. I read The Lord of the Rings 5 times in one year. I loved it so much, and it certainly set me on this track that I've ended up on now. But a few years ago, when the films first came out, I thought I'd have a go at reading it again to see how I felt about it now, and I couldn't get all the way through. It was too boring.
Wow.
So, but that's okay. I appreciate the fact that I loved it when I was a teenager, and I appreciate that it sparked my interest in, because he was, of course, a professor who knew his Old English and his Old Norse, and it kind of set me off in this direction. So good for him.
Yeah, but the real Norse sagas spoiled you because they're so exciting that they made Lord of the Rings look tame.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a fair comment.
Well, they're simply inherently interesting in a culture that can, at the same time raid monasteries and steal things and enslave people and do what are, by all accounts, terrible things. And yet, try to set up a proto-democracy and, do something fairly sophisticated like that. I mean, it's just the dichotomy just like makes it interesting inherently, I think.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you there.
Well, I think that's probably a good place as any to end. CJ, do you have anything else to ask?
Oh, that's a really fun conversation.
Yeah, it's great. So thank you again so much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's great to talk to you both and get the two slightly different perspectives from the historian and the novelist. That's really interesting. So well done on coming together in this way.
Yeah, well, like the Vikings, we sort of figure that this is fate because, we have this interest together, but we also are born on the same day. So.
Oh, yeah.
We're birthday buddies.
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
The Norns have woven our fate together. So.
May I ask which day?
September 18th.
Oh no, doesn't mean anything to me. Sorry.
Oh.
It's actually the wait. I've forgotten what it was. There's something Viking about it, like for the Battle of Hastings, like it's like the lead up, right? It's kind of it's a fall campaign, right?
There might have been something on that day, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's closer. Like it's only a week away from the Battle of Stamford Bridge.
Yeah.
So probably
right.
it's Harold.
That was the 25th of September, wasn't it? Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so every year the Jorvik Viking Center on their social media puts out, for 2 weeks leading up to the event, they put out these little things of like, this happened on this day and this had, and I remember September 18th was something. I mean, it wasn't super exciting, but it was like, oh yeah, on my birthday, like this guy died. Great.
The ships of Harold, the last Viking, showed up on the shore.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your evening.
We've got an exciting weekend coming up, of course, with the coronation.
Oh yes, that's right. King Charles.
Absolutely.
I'm sure there'll be 1 billion Americans watching that.
Yeah, maybe them rather than me, but
yeah. we'll edit that part out.
Thank you.
Yeah, my mom's committed to watching it, so there's one.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Bye.